I walked into the courtroom expecting to observe, not to become the center of chaos. One mistaken identity, one judge's snap judgment, and suddenly, I'm standing at the crossroads of justice and bias. What started as a simple misunderstanding spiraled into a fight that could expose the cracks in the very system I've dedicated my life to. They thought they knew me, but they're about to find out the truth. Based on a true story. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The courthouse was humming with activity, a cacophony of shuffling papers, hurried footsteps, and murmured conversations. I sat quietly near the back, observing the proceedings. I wasn't there for a case of my own, I had wrapped up my last one just yesterday, but something about these small hearings fascinated me. They revealed the humanity and the flaws in our justice system, the little cracks that people like me tried to patch one argument at a time. I glanced at my watch. It was nearly noon, and the courtroom was packed with people waiting their turn to stand before the bench. The room was a mixture of frustration and anxiety, faces lined with worry or fatigue. I could feel the tension in the air as each person shuffled forward, eager to plead their case or hear their fate. That's when I heard my name. Angela Carter, the judge called out, his tone sharp, his eyes scanning the room impatiently. For a moment, I froze. I hadn't expected to be summoned, my name wasn't on any docket. Slowly, I stood, feeling the weight of every gaze turning toward me. Judge Marcus Trenton, presiding over this small district courtroom, narrowed his eyes. His face was lined with years of experience, but the judgment in his expression was immediate and clear. "Yes, Your Honor," I said, stepping forward, keeping my voice steady. He didn't bother to look at the folder in front of him, didn't ask any questions. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and tapped his gavel against the bench. "Ms. Carter, I see you've been cited for a traffic violation and failed to pay your fine. That's $150, payable immediately." I blinked, taken aback. "Your Honor, I believe there's been a mistake." His eyes sharpened, and he let out a low, dismissive chuckle. "A mistake? You're telling me the system made an error?" "Yes, sir," I replied calmly, though my pulse quickened. "I'm not here as a defendant. I'm here as an observer." The courtroom grew quieter, the tension palpable. I could feel people whispering behind me, their curiosity piqued. Judge Trenton leaned forward, his voice dropping an octave, making it clear he didn't appreciate being challenged. "Ms. Carter, I don't have time for excuses. You're wasting the court's time. Pay the fine or face further penalties." I stared at him, my mind racing. I could have ended this in a heartbeat. I could have said the words that would put this whole charade to rest. But something made me hesitate. It wasn't the first time I'd seen someone like him make assumptions. I knew exactly what he saw when he looked at me, a black woman, casually dressed, not the Angela Carter who stood before the Supreme Court last year or the Angela Carter who had overturned unjust laws in 3 states. I exhaled slowly, forcing a smile to my lips. "Your Honor, with all due respect, may I approach the bench?" He waved me forward, his irritation evident. As I moved closer, I caught glimpses of the people watching, some amused, others shocked, but most just curious. They didn't know who I was, either. "You've got 30 seconds, Ms. Carter," Judge Trenton said. "I don't run a charity here." I stopped just short of the bench, folding my hands neatly. "I'd like to address the citation you mentioned. Could I see the record, please?" He smirked, clearly amused by my request, and gestured for the clerk to hand me the file. I scanned it quickly. As I suspected, it wasn't my citation. It wasn't even my name. Angela Cartwright, close, but not quite. "Your Honor," I said, looking up, "this isn't my citation. The name is Angela Cartwright, not Carter." I handed the file back and met his gaze steadily. I'd also like to note that I was not issued any summons or notice of this fine. His face reddened slightly, but he masked it with a curt nod. Clerk, correct the record. Ms. Carter, you're dismissed. I stepped back, but instead of returning to my seat, I paused. The weight of what had just happened wasn't lost on me. How many people had stood here before him, misjudged or silenced, simply because they didn't have the means or the confidence to speak up? As I walked back to my seat, my resolve hardened. I wasn't done here, not by a long shot. Judge Trenton's voice cut through the murmurs in the courtroom like a whip. Let's move on. Next case. He shuffled the papers on his bench, avoiding eye contact with me. The tension in the air lingered, like the buzz after a lightning strike. I leaned back in my chair, my mind replaying the interaction. The ease with which he had dismissed me, barely bothering to check the file before fining me, wasn't just an oversight. It was a pattern. One I had seen play out time and again, both in and out of courtrooms. But this time, I was in the middle of it, and I wasn't going to let it slide. The next defendant shuffled to the front, an older man with a worn suit and a nervous twitch in his hands. The judge barely glanced up. Late on your payment for a parking violation, Trenton said brusquely. Do you have the money today, or should I schedule a hearing for failure to comply? The man stammered, his words coming out in pieces. I tried to pay, Your Honor, but the website. Enough, Trenton interrupted, waving a hand. Pay it by the end of the week or face a penalty. I watched the man's shoulders slump as he nodded and walked away. My jaw tightened. This was no longer about me. This was about the system, and how people like Judge Trenton wielded their authority unchecked. I raised my hand. Your Honor, may I ask a question? The room went silent again. The judge's head snapped up, his irritation flaring. Ms. Carter, this is not a classroom. Sit down. I'm not questioning your authority, I said evenly, keeping my voice measured, but I was curious about the process. For the sake of clarity, how often do errors in case assignments occur? He glared at me, his eyes narrowing. Errors are rare, Ms. Carter. The system is efficient when it's not bogged down by unnecessary commentary. I smiled faintly, nodding. Of course. I'm just curious if there's a review process in place when discrepancies like mine arise. It seems important to ensure accuracy, especially when penalties are involved. A ripple of whispers moved through the courtroom. Trenton's irritation deepened, but he maintained his composure, addressing me with an icy tone. Ms. Carter, if you have concerns about the judicial process, I suggest you file them through proper channels. I held his gaze, unflinching. Thank you for the clarification, Your Honor. I will do just that. He returned to his docket, clearly eager to move on, but the seeds of doubt were already planted. I could see it in the faces of the courtroom spectators, the quiet realization that perhaps the system they had taken for granted wasn't as infallible as they thought. As the proceedings continued, I watched and waited, each case adding to the growing picture of how deeply ingrained the judge's biases were. A young woman with a toddler in her arms was fined without a second thought, her explanation cut off mid-sentence. A middle-aged man with limited English struggled to understand the charges against him, and the judge waved him off with a curt, "Translator next time." Every interaction followed the same script, dismissive, impersonal, and devoid of empathy. By the time the docket was nearing its end, I felt a shift in the room. The spectators were no longer just watching, they were scrutinizing. I wasn't the only one who noticed. Trenton's frustration grew, his tone sharper, his rulings more abrupt. Finally, he slammed his gavel down. Recess. 10 minutes. As he rose and disappeared into his chambers, the room buzzed with low conversations. People whispered about the cases, about the judge, about me. I stayed seated, pretending to scroll through my phone while mentally rehearsing my next move. A journalist seated a few rows ahead glanced back at me. I caught his eye briefly and gave him a small nod. He was typing furiously, and I had no doubt he was documenting every word, every interaction. I wondered if he recognized me, or if he was simply intrigued by the spectacle unfolding before him. When Trenton returned, his face was flushed, though he tried to mask it with his usual stern demeanor. "Court is back in session. Let's finish this docket." I leaned forward slightly in my chair, ready to push just a little further. This wasn't over, not yet. The courtroom buzzed with a renewed sense of anticipation as Judge Trenton returned to his seat. His robe swished as he sat, his expression a strained mask of authority. I could tell the earlier exchange had rattled him more than he let on. Good. The cracks were starting to show. "Next case," Trenton barked, flipping through his docket without looking up. As another defendant stepped forward, I leaned back in my chair, mentally preparing for my next move. I couldn't let the judge's behavior slide, not when it was clear how many people had suffered under his dismissive rulings. But before I could act, a faint buzz rippled through the courtroom. Someone's phone vibrated on the wooden bench ahead of me. Then another. The journalist from earlier glanced at his device, his eyes widening as he furiously began typing again. I frowned, suddenly alert. The courtroom door creaked open, and two unfamiliar figures slipped inside, their presence commanding immediate attention. They were dressed sharply, with badges clipped to their belts. Reporters, no doubt, or maybe legal watchdogs. My pulse quickened as I realized what was happening. The journalist turned to me, his face alight with recognition. "Angela Carter, right? The civil rights attorney," he whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. I froze. The room, already tense, seemed to tilt on its axis. Heads turned, whispers growing louder as my name spread like wildfire. Judge Trenton's gavel slammed down, echoing like a gunshot. "Order. There will be order in this courtroom." But the whispers didn't stop. If anything, they grew louder. People began pulling out their phones, some snapping pictures, others recording. Trenton's face turned crimson as he scanned the room, finally landing on me. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, his voice shaking with barely restrained anger, "I don't know what you're playing at, but this is my courtroom. If you disrupt these proceedings again, I will have you removed." I stood, my heart pounding but my expression calm. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I've disrupted nothing. But it seems others have realized something important, something you failed to recognize." I gestured around the room. "Perhaps now is the time to address it." The journalist's voice rose from the back. "Judge, are you aware that Ms. Carter is a prominent civil rights attorney? She's overturned 3 state laws and argued before the Supreme Court." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, and even a few cheers filled the space. Trenton's face darkened as he struggled to regain control. He slammed his gavel again, but this time, it was like trying to dam a river with a pebble. "Silence," he bellowed, his voice cracking. I held up a hand, and the room gradually quieted. "Your Honor," I said, my voice carrying across the space, "I didn't come here to cause a scene. But your assumptions today have highlighted something important, not just about me, but about how many others in this room have been treated." Trenton leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his bench. "Ms. Carter, if you think you can come into my courtroom and undermine my authority—" "I don't need to undermine your authority," I interrupted, my tone sharp but controlled. "You've done that yourself." The room fell silent. Trenton's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came. The power dynamic had shifted, and he knew it. Suddenly, the door burst open again, and a camera crew filed in, followed by more journalists. The story had gone viral, and the courthouse was now the epicenter of a media frenzy. Reporters shouted questions, their microphones and cameras pointed at me. Ms. Carter, were you mistreated by the court? Do you believe Judge Trenton acted out of bias? What does this incident say about systemic racism in the judiciary? Trenton's composure finally shattered. Get them out of here, he roared, pointing at the bailiff. Clear the courtroom. The bailiff hesitated, clearly overwhelmed by the chaos. I stepped forward, raising my hands to quiet the crowd. Please, I said, addressing both the reporters and the spectators. Let's not turn this into a circus. This is about more than one incident, it's about the patterns we've all witnessed today. The murmur subsided, and I turned back to Trenton, whose face was now a mottled mix of rage and humiliation. Your Honor, I said, my voice steady, I'd like to formally request the opportunity to address this court, not as a defendant, but as a civil rights attorney with a vested interest in ensuring fairness and justice. For a moment, the courtroom was utterly silent. Then, to my surprise, Trenton nodded stiffly. You have 2 minutes, he said through gritted teeth. I stepped forward, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. This was my moment, not just to defend myself, but to speak for everyone who had ever been silenced or dismissed by a system that claimed to serve them. As I began to speak, I knew the tide had turned, and the truth would not be ignored. The room had quieted, but the tension was electric. I could feel every pair of eyes on me as I stepped toward the bench. The spotlight was no longer just on Judge Trenton, it was on the system he represented, a system that had dismissed too many voices for too long. I drew a steady breath. Your Honor, I came here today expecting to observe the legal process, not participate in it. But after witnessing how this courtroom operates, I feel compelled to speak. The way cases are handled here raises questions about fairness and impartiality. Trenton's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. The murmurs from the crowd earlier had likely tempered his response, the media presence was now impossible to ignore. Take today, for example, I continued. You assumed I was a defendant based on nothing more than my appearance and an erroneous citation. How often does this happen to people without the resources or experience to defend themselves? I gestured toward the spectators, many of whom nodded or murmured in agreement. Trenton's voice was sharp when he finally responded. Ms. Carter, I don't appreciate being accused of bias in my courtroom. If there are concerns about my rulings, they can be addressed through the proper legal channels. And how accessible are those channels to someone living paycheck to paycheck? I asked, my tone calm but unyielding. How many people have walked out of this room feeling silenced, unheard, and punished for circumstances beyond their control? A ripple of applause broke out in the back of the room, quickly silenced by a glare from Trenton. He glanced at the reporters, their cameras and notepads ready to capture his every move, and I could see the cracks forming in his stern facade. As I continued, I shifted my focus to the audience. The law should protect and serve, not intimidate or dismiss. Too often, those who most need justice find it least accessible. This isn't about one judge or one courtroom, it's about a system that prioritizes efficiency over empathy, procedure over fairness. A man in the back stood up, his voice trembling but firm. She's right. I've been coming here for months trying to sort out a mistake on my record, and no one's listened. They just keep fining me. His words emboldened others. A young woman spoke up next, holding her toddler close. I begged for an extension on a parking ticket because I couldn't afford it, and all I got was a penalty twice as high. The room buzzed with more voices, more stories. Trenton's gavel slammed down repeatedly, but the crowd wasn't silenced this time. The room had shifted, the power no longer entirely in his hands. You're out of line, Ms. Carter, Trenton snapped, his voice cracking. This is a courtroom, not a platform for political speeches. I met his gaze, calm and unwavering. With all due respect, Your Honor, the courtroom is where justice should begin. If we can't address these issues here, then where? The tension hung thick in the air as he glared at me, visibly grappling with how to respond. Before he could speak, one of the journalists raised his voice. "Judge Trenton, weren't you informed that Ms. Carter was scheduled to deliver a lecture on implicit bias at this courthouse today?" The room froze. Trenton's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of panic crossing his face. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice a mix of anger and confusion. I turned to the journalist, who was now scrolling through his phone. "It's right here," he said, holding it up for the room to see. A mess. "Carter was invited weeks ago to speak to the judiciary about systemic bias in the legal process. Did no one inform you?" The silence in the room was deafening. Trenton's face darkened as he realized the weight of what had just been revealed. He had not only misjudged me but also failed to prepare for an event that could reshape perceptions of his courtroom. "That's irrelevant to the matter at hand," Trenton said, though his voice lacked its usual authority. "On the contrary," I said, stepping forward, "it's entirely relevant. Today's events illustrate exactly why this conversation is so necessary. It's not just about me, it's about everyone who's ever been dismissed or mistreated in this room." The courtroom door opened again, and a clerk hurried in, whispering something to the judge. His face reddened further, and he slammed his gavel again. "Court is adjourned for the day." The room erupted into chaos, reporters shouting questions, spectators voicing their frustrations. But amidst the noise, I felt a sense of resolution. The system might not change overnight, but today, the cracks had been exposed for all to see. As I left the courthouse, the cameras followed, capturing every step. The sun was blinding as I walked out onto the steps, but I didn't feel small beneath its glare. I felt ready to keep fighting, to keep speaking out, until the system changed for everyone. The sun blazed down on the courthouse steps as I stood before a crowd of reporters and onlookers. Their questions came in rapid fire, blending into an indistinguishable hum. I raised a hand to quiet them, my heart still pounding from the intensity of the courtroom confrontation. The air felt heavy with the weight of what had just happened, but also alive with the possibility of change. "I'm not here to attack one individual," I began, my voice steady, though my emotions swirled beneath the surface. "This isn't about Judge Trenton alone. It's about a system that has been failing people for decades, a system that too often silences those it is supposed to serve." The cameras clicked furiously as I continued. Today wasn't just a mistake. It was a reminder of how bias, whether conscious or unconscious, can warp the very foundations of justice. This isn't a fight I take lightly, but it's one I'm committed to seeing through. As the crowd erupted into cheers and applause, I stepped back, giving the reporters the soundbite they wanted. I didn't need to linger in the spotlight, I knew the real work was waiting for me elsewhere. The courthouse doors slammed open behind me, and Judge Trenton emerged, flanked by clerks and assistants. His face was a mask of fury and shame, but he kept his head high, refusing to acknowledge the cameras. I turned, catching his gaze for a brief moment. It wasn't defiance I saw in his eyes, it was something closer to fear. Fear of losing control, fear of being exposed for what he had allowed to happen in his courtroom. I hoped that fear would translate into reflection, but I couldn't count on it. Change rarely came from fear alone. That evening, I sat in my office, scrolling through article after article about the day's events. The headlines ranged from sensational to scathing. Judge faces backlash after confrontation with civil rights attorney. Angela Carter calls out bias in the courtroom. A system on trial, how one woman sparked a legal reckoning. The attention was gratifying, but it was also overwhelming. For every supportive comment, there were dozens questioning my intentions, accusing me of showboating, or claiming I had staged the entire incident for publicity. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of it all settling over me. Even when you won, the fight never really ended. A knock at my door broke my thoughts. I looked up to see Sarah, my longtime paralegal, holding a folder in one hand and a mug of coffee in the other. "You're trending," she said with a wry smile, setting the coffee on my desk. "I noticed," I replied, gesturing to my laptop. "Don't let it get to you," she said, her tone softening. "You did something important today. People are listening." I nodded, though the lingering tension in my chest didn't ease. "Did you get the transcripts I asked for?" She handed me the folder. Every case Judge Trenton ruled on in the past month. There's a clear pattern: higher penalties for minority defendants, shorter hearing times, fewer accommodations for language barriers. It's all here. I flipped through the documents, each page a damning piece of evidence. "This is what we needed," I said, a sense of purpose igniting in me again. "It's not enough to expose what happened today. We have to make sure it leads to real accountability." A week later, I stood in the same courthouse, but this time, the atmosphere was different. The media frenzy had died down, replaced by a quiet determination among those present. I had been invited back, not as a defendant or a guest, but as the keynote speaker for a judicial seminar on implicit bias. The irony wasn't lost on me. Judge Trenton sat in the front row, his expression unreadable. The seminar wasn't optional, and while I doubted he was happy to see me, his presence was a small victory in itself. As I took the podium, I scanned the room filled with judges, attorneys, and clerks. Today, we're here to talk about justice, not just as a concept, but as a practice. Justice isn't static, it evolves. And for it to evolve, we must confront the biases that influence our decisions, no matter how uncomfortable that might be. The room was silent as I spoke, the words coming from a place deeper than rhetoric. They came from experience, from pain, and from the hope that the system could be better than it was. For the first time since the incident, I felt a sense of peace. This was where I was meant to be, not just fighting the system, but working to change it from within. As I left the courthouse that day, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the city. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but I knew I wasn't fighting alone. The cracks had been exposed, and through them, the light was beginning to shine.